Tom Rankin. I'm the tech director at the Alchemedia Project. Let me start off. Thanks, Toby. Let me start off real quick and understand where the room is as far as Git knowledge. Who's really never heard of Git? Okay, Git newbies, kind of getting started with some Git work. Use Git daily, but really don't use a lot of the core features of it or the heavy features of it. And then Git gurus. Git guru. Okay, so Git guru. Fair enough. So. This is going to be a high-level presentation. I'm not going to talk about specifically the commands. I'm going to spend a little bit more time talking about the concepts. It's a little bit of a different style of a presentation. It's my first time giving it, so I'll probably struggle. I'll forget a few things, but bear with me. But anyway, I'm going to go pretty high level, and the idea here is to establish a mental model for how things work rather than to give you a working set of things to take away and start executing, right? It's really just about establishing what some of the concepts are and some of the flows so that you can incorporate that into your daily work. With that, I guess I wanted to first establish, a lot of people think of Git and GitHub at the same time, right? And Git and GitHub are not the same thing. So I'm going to start with what Git is. And Git is basically a set of tools that you can install on your computer to start tracking version history of files in your projects, right? So one of the first things that we'll talk about, can you see this kind of okay? Right, so I just installed Git and I spun up a new project, right? The dot in this presentation is going to represent what's called a commit, okay? Think of a commit as a timestamp or a snapshot of your source code, right? So you start a project, you create all the base folders, you might create your first page, and then you snapshot it. Right, so that's what the kind of a commit stands for. Think of it as a snapshot of your source code at that point in time. Right, so I go to my next commit and say I've added the jQuery library. So I commit that, and I kind of keep track of how this progress or how this project is progressing. Right. You may come in, add another commit, and I've changed all the page titles on my site. I'm giving you hypotheticals here because it doesn't really matter, right? It's like something happened, and I'm snapshotting what I did, right? You get to the point where you're really satisfied with your work, right? I just added a bunch of CAD images on here. Everything's good. I'm ready to launch this and deploy. So we have this concept called tagging, right? So I've released this major feature of my site, and we're going to call that 1.0, okay? So that's basically the work, right? You kind of keep doing work, you keep tagging it, and life is good, right? I've got this history that I can now kind of always go back to and see how my project has progressed. One thing that I would say regarding commits is try to keep the work discrete. What I mean by that is don't try to lump too many types of changes in your project all into one commit. Don't go forever and add your CAD images and add jQuery and add Twitter Bootstrap and all this kind of stuff all in one big commit. Try to keep those things separate so that if you ever decide that you want to go back and pull something out, you can literally just revert a commit, right? You can just go back to that commit and say, I don't want those changes anymore, take those out and not necessarily affect the entire project. It's just something to think about with your commits. Try to keep them segregated, isolated to kind of a specific group of changes instead of stuff that's all over the place, okay? One of the concepts in Git that is really beneficial is the ability to branch, right? So right here we've indicated this is kind of a timeline of changes, and that's really called a branch, right? Where it's linear. Git makes it super easy and super cheap to create a branch for this, basically to make a new tree off of this kind of current point and start making change sets, right? So that I can jump back and forth between one version of my project and then another working version or something like that too, right? So let's say we've got this newfangled HTML boiler strap that we want to add to our project, right? It's this great thing, but it's a pretty big change. It's a little risky, so I don't want to include that in my core work. So I branch that out and I call it, I'm going to run this experiment, right? I make a couple of changes, I get some of it working and decide HTML boiler strap sucks, right? I don't want it. I'm not going to bring this back into my main line. At that point, you can just orphan it, right? You can delete that branch, go back into your mainline branch, and keep editing and keep making changes, right? You can basically say, I made that branch, I tried it out, I didn't like it, just let it go, right? It doesn't affect yet your full history of your work at this point. Keep making changes. We have a new branch that we want to create now because we want to add Twitter Bootstrap. Say we didn't have Twitter Bootstrap in here before. Branch that out, give it a shot. It's all good. And at the very end of that, right, we can merge those changes back into our mainline branch. So at this point, the history of this commit includes all of the changes in this line, including all of these from this experiment that kind of came down into it, right? So if you ever look back on your history, you'll see these commits as part of that set of changes. Okay? Commit, commit, commit. Life is good, right? That's the first phase of this. Any questions about some of these concepts? This is first stage, committing and branching. All right, so next I want to introduce, clarify, because I'm going on to the next step where I'm going to talk about GitHub a little bit. This is local development. If you're an individual developer, you can install Git on your computer and keep track of all of your source, right, by yourself. A lot of people think I'm an individual developer, I'm solo, I don't need to necessarily keep track of this stuff. Then all of a sudden I want to jump back to what I did 30 days ago or 40 days ago, and I don't have that. Git makes it easy to spin that stuff up on your own project, and you have basically source history. Excuse me. But, in my opinion, a little bit risky. I use GitHub for all of my personal projects. When I ran this presentation, I spun up a GitHub account or a GitHub repository and used this. So, think of GitHub really quick. It is a web-based repository management system. So when you use Git locally, you create a repository, and basically it's a little database of changes and all your commits and all that kind of stuff. But GitHub is a web-based system, and I like to think of it as, when it's my personal projects, it's a backup, right? It's a place that I can take all of my changes, I make all my commits locally, and if my computer were to crash or whatever, I don't want to lose all this stuff. I'll sync all that stuff up to GitHub. That way I can always kind of pull that stuff back down in the future. So right, start with it at GitHub. You make a copy locally. This is called cloning, right? Start your commits, make a few changes. I get my cats in, I feel like I'm good, right? And I push those changes back up to GitHub, right? So at this point, this whole history can really be reflected in GitHub. Same difference, I make my commits, I push up to GitHub, and then all the other workflow stuff really still applies, right? I can still do my experiments, I can orphan them, right? Make some additional changes, keep going out, and then as I hit my milestones that I feel like I really need to keep track of this, I need to back this stuff up, I push those changes back out to GitHub. Okay? Any questions regarding that?
Is the local a GitHub app, or is it Git?
Git. The local is Git. So GitHub has basically a copy of the same data files that your local machine has. You're literally pushing those files up there, and it's keeping track of them as well. In fact, when you do a Git push, it's literally modifying the file system out there to reflect what's in your data set. And a couple of other things that it's checking in between, but yeah. Admittedly, so I realize I'm talking about GitHub here. GitHub is actually much larger than just a source code repository, right? It's collaboration. It's got a whole lot of other workflow stuff in there. Plus, there's another alternative called Bitbucket, right? They're really about the same thing. They have different focuses on what they do, but Bitbucket and GitHub are really the same thing. One bills you for the number of private repositories you have. The other one bills you for the number of teams you have. If it's mostly personal stuff, right, and you don't care if the world sees your projects, GitHub is probably the best place for you because they don't care how many public repositories that you have. If it's mostly private personal stuff and things that you don't want the world to have access to, Bitbucket's probably a better bet because they don't charge you for the number of repositories that are private. They charge you for the number of users who have access to your repositories. So if it's just going to be a few people or just yourself and you don't want the world to see your repositories, Bitbucket might be a better a better location for that, all right? All right. All right, so the next step is we're going to start over. The pattern here that I'm trying to illustrate is that once you introduce GitHub, it's really just kind of a centralized place to push code. So we start off with GitHub again. We start our local project, same local project per se, right? So I'm really just kind of reiterating that. I make some commits, I get my cats out, I push that back up to GitHub, and I decide at this point I need help, right? I need Jason to come onto my project and kind of give me some support. I've got a deadline now that I can't meet. So Jason, Bob, right? Bob now clones from that GitHub account into his local machine, right? So he now has a copy of everything that happened up to that point, including my latest cat image per se. Right? Bob starts doing some of his work. I'm doing my work at the same time. Got a little parallel path going on right here. Bob gets done with his work before I do, right? So Bob releases his work, and at this point, I'm out of sync, right? Bob may have changed some files that I've changed, or we may have diverged a little bit. He may have added jQuery 1.1, and I needed jQuery 1.3, etc., right? So at that point, I can sync all those changes back to my local, right? When you're working in a team or in a scenario like this, it's pretty important to pretty regularly check in and get the latest copy from the central repository or wherever it is, right? That way, you avoid some really nasty, what's called merging conflicts, right? Bob changed everything, I changed all the same stuff, and then when I go to pull his code down, Git is basically going to scream and say, hey, look, all the things that you think you want to push up, Bob has done something with. I don't know how to merge those two things together, right? You got to go through this manual process then at that point of deciding whose files are correct, whose files need to be maintained. So if you check in pretty regularly, you can really avoid that almost entirely. Communicate a little bit about what you're working on, check in, and keep up to date pretty regularly, and really you're pretty good. Right, so I made changes, I pushed them back up to GitHub, I start making some more changes, Bob comes in, he's going to work some more. He gets the latest copy before he gets too much work going on again, right? And all the other workflow stuff still applies, right? Bob can run experiments, I can run them, decide that we want to orphan those things, right? Parallel workflows, but really syncing up with kind of GitHub. Look familiar? Bob finished his Twitter Bootstrap. I'm finishing up my angularization here. Bob syncs. I pull his stuff down. Right, life is good. Okay. Follow the concept? Questions? Yeah, right on. I got about 3 minutes of material left, so this is going to be all right. All right, so these concepts really, the reason I'm talking about them is because some people aren't familiar with committing and branching at all. And I'm going to start rolling into now what Gitflow is. So Vincent Dreisen in 2010 kind of formalized how to manage your branches. Anytime you see a path, like you see a path in here in this perspective, that's a branch, right? And what Vincent did, I say Victor Vincent, what he did was he basically said, here's a pattern of how we're going to create branches to streamline team-based workflows, right? Here's kind of a way to think about what these branches mean so that the project is always in kind of a known state, okay? So we mostly use this pattern, and you can adopt, you can kind of adopt what you want. It's going to go top down, only because I wanted to show a little bit of a different mental model here. We're going to look at a project from a single user's perspective. Okay, so remember that first session I did where it was just the local execution, one timeline, one set of branches. That's basically what we're going to look at here. There's going to be about 3 or 4 types of branches that we're going to do here. But you can assume that multiple people are doing things like syncing, pushing and pulling changes all along this place. I'm not going to talk about that in this perspective, in this workflow. Just assume that that's the kind of thing that's occurring, right? this is now multi-user mode, but presented as if it were one repository. All right, so we start off with what's called the master branch, right? Master is pretty regular. Anytime you create a Git repository, you get init something, the first thing it's going to do is kind of give you a master branch. Master in Gitflow, and master for us, is a branch that basically reflects what's in production, right? If you can go to the last commit on the master branch, that should be what you've released to production. So that way you don't ever guess. You don't ever have to guess about where was I? Did I get this stuff out to production? Did I get that stuff out to production? You kind of always know. If it's in master, it's been deployed. Effectively is how we like to think about it, right? So we're very protective then about pushing things into the master branch. So we do all of our work on a develop branch, right? So all the day-to-day stuff, I've got bug fixes, I've got graphics that we need to load, etc., adding the libraries, the day-to-day stuff we do in a develop branch, right? And we basically just continue on with the regular committing pattern there. Gitflow is very much centered and very much focused around the concept of a release and a release cycle, okay? Think about your projects and your teams that you work with that are long running. I mean, I know some of our friends over at Marlin and all that, we have projects that have a pretty lengthy cycle. And we release multiple times, maybe multiple times a year, maybe multiple times in a month. And what we do is we get together and we plan what our release cycles are going to be. So on this release, we're going to have these features in it. The release that we're going to do after that will have this set of features in it, right? So Gitflow is very much centered around the concept that you're planning and having regular releases, right? So I get my development done, and that all this development in this branch is geared toward the next release. When you feel like everything is good, you branch out, right? Everything was good with where we were in develop. You branch out from develop and create a release branch. What this basically represents is we're now going into testing, right? So we're now going to have our team review all of the changes that are in here because this is a release candidate. What's currently in this branch is what we're getting ready to go live with if everything is good. Okay? Meanwhile, work can continue on and develop. Other people of the team are working on the next release, right? So we've got this release and we've got everything going on in here. We're getting ready to deploy. That doesn't keep the team from moving on, right? We got to the stage we needed to be. We got the release started. They're moving on with their work. At this point, you're not building features and functions and things like that into this release branch. It's bug fixes only, right? If it were a feature or something like that, it should have been planned and it should have been scheduled for a release. So at this point, this is just bug fixes. These things didn't work the way that we expected to. Now that we've got the team in there. And you remember that we had master up here, right? So at this point, we feel like everything is good. The release is done. We merge those changes into master. So master now reflects we've got a good solid release. And if there were bug fixes, we pull that stuff back into develop, right? So everybody who's been continuing on with the next release cycle has all the changes that we had to fix in the bugs before we release and all that kind of stuff. Keeps our code nice and clean. We don't lose changes. We don't lose bug fixes and things like that, right? Any questions about that before I go on? Yeah?
Would you end up with a lot of manual merging at that point if you're trying to, if you've done development work along the way?
So anytime you get several commits down a path and several commits down a parallel path, the longer you go without getting them to sync, the more risk you have of having painful merges. Yeah. In theory, though, you can merge those changes in. I mean, I could have merged, like if I had these bug fixes in and I knew it was going to be maybe a day or two before I got into the next set, I can merge that change back into develop manually, right? I can always kind of keep those things back going saying, this is a big one. Everybody's working on this file that we found this massive bug in. I'm going to pull that back into the development branch so that everybody gets that right away before they get too far down the path.
Yeah, smaller your commits are too, the more likely Git can automatically fix the conflicts for you.
Right. Yeah, that's along the same lines too. If you wait 3 days before making a commit, right, then you've got a lot of opportunity for some of those files to be in conflict with other changes, and then it gets pretty painful. If you're Git is awesome. So I was a big centralized guy with Subversion, and I find that Git is really a pretty powerful tool, but I find that I like to keep everything really clean, right? I don't like to keep a lot of files that are not in my repository that I've not committed. I don't like to keep a lot of stuff just hanging out there. I like to keep track of everything, get committed, get into a clean state, and kind of go, right? Release 1.0 is done. And just FYI, I'm using the major minor patch kind of versioning here. Major version, minor version, and then you'll see in another bit. But right, some more changes. Got another release, more concurrent dev. Right, so I'm just showing that we scheduled release 1, we're scheduled release 2, kind of thing, and we're moving on. All right. I'm going to talk about the next concept, which is a feature branch. So go back to the experiment that we were running before, right? I had these changes. I had the HTML5 boiler strap or whatever that I was going to add in the project. It's so awesome. We've scheduled that for release, okay? Regardless, we want to separate that out. There are a couple of reasons you would want to separate out a branch when you're in a cycle like this, right? One, I've got a dev that's working on something that's not for the next release, right? They're working on something that's scheduled for 1.3. We're gonna change this thing out to Elasticsearch. So he's gonna branch from where we are right now and start doing the Elasticsearch work. And say I've got another dev who's got Twitter Bootstrap coming in to the next release, which is 1.2. Okay. Maybe a little bit tough. You got any questions there? So this is the way to have concurrent development, but they're not necessarily scheduled for the same release cycle. Okay.
And so, can you just explain a little bit?
Uh-huh.
At what point would it make more sense to feature branch versus that release branch shown above?
Versus the release branch?
Yeah. When does it make more sense to do stuff over in a feature versus a release?
So for me, a release is only for that specific cycle of testing and pushing to production. Feature is still development work. It's still potentially speculative work. It's not necessarily ready for release, right? So it's long-running work, things that I may not want to break. So I'll give you an example. I'm changing out the entire language in this thing or something like that, right? And it's going to be broken for quite a while. So I pulled down the code. I know I'm making changes that will make it impossible for you, Mike, to pull up your code base and work with if I were to commit this on the development branch, because I knew this thing had bugs. I got 3/4 of the code done. It won't compile, won't run. So I want to keep this branch clean so that devs can always get kind of a running copy. And then these things are things that we just want to keep out of that main cycle because they're a little bit more risky. They may have more changes associated with them, or they're not quite ready for this next release. But the release branch itself means we've hit our goal and we're testing to deploy. Right, so that's entirely what this is testing, deploy, fix the bugs, deploy, pull any changes back into the develop branch, move on to the next stage, okay?
Yeah, I think that's the separation I was looking for. So theoretically, when you're working on features, you know they're slated for a set release. You know it's expected to go on 1.2.
Yeah.
You might have 4 other things you only want to.
Yeah, right.
So you feature all 4 of those things
You
out.
could, yeah, you could.
Work in them, and then once you feel like they're all buttoned up and you're getting to a buttoned up state, that's when you release branch.
Yeah, so admittedly, like at this point, any work that's occurring in this line after here, like this blue commit, that's all stuff that should be slated for 1.2. That's the next release. This stuff is just isolated out so that developer feels confident that they're not muddying the water with those changes while they're doing those things, right? But once they're done, once he's got Bootstrap done, he merges that stuff back into the main development branch, right? All those code changes that he's got, they're in there, they're good. He's got them ready for the next release, and we start the next release cycle, okay? Bug fixes start to occur, right, on the next release cycle, but because I've made this and we're testing, he may have had Elasticsearch done a long time ago, right? He got it done. He didn't push it in before we started the release cycle. But now that the release has started, he can merge his code back in, and again, development can continue in that development branch, not worried about what's going to the next release. These people, QA department and all the testers, are fixing all the stuff in that release branch to get it ready to go. Make sense? Good stuff? All right, same difference. Once I'm done with the release, I merge it into master. Master now reflects release 1.2 is good. It's been done. It's been deployed, right? And I've gotten that code set back into my development branch for any bug fixes that we may have run into during that cycle. All right, so far, really everything, if you'll notice, feature branches and release branches all run off of the development branch, right? It's all work in progress, things moving forward to get to a release. We only push things into master when we deploy them, right? Master reflects what's in production for us. If you're not going to go live with it, don't put it into master. I mean, that's really all there is to it, and that way you never have to worry about when you're logged into the server and you got some files out there. There's never a question about how this thing got here, right? Who made this change to this file manually on the server? Shouldn't happen, because all those changes should be really logged in your source repository, right? And it always should reflect the last commit. So Gitflow really focuses primarily on having the dev branch moving forward, hitting release cycles, and master is super clean, super pristine about what's in there. But lo and behold, I've got a major bug in the system, in the live system, right? Legal. I've got some legal copy or whatever in the system that says we can't say this or we can't do this, or I've got a library or I've got some photography up there that's against the law, and I have to get that out right now, right? But I've already got changes, right? I already have changes in dev since the last. I've already got changes in dev since the last release. I mean, I can't make the changes here and then push those and get those back out to master. So what we do is we call this type of a fix is called a hot fix, right? I've got a live running system. I need to fix that live running system. So in this case, we create a branch, but we branch that from master. Okay, so basically we're taking a snapshot of what we currently have in production. We're applying the fix there, right? It may take a couple of changes, right? I missed something. We test it out before we deploy it. Dev work is continuing on. I merged that change once that's good, though. I've got the hotfix in. I stripped those images out. I took the illegal library out, merged that into master, merged that back into dev. So the dev group doesn't now continue on with their dev cycle without having these libraries and these things in there. And lo and behold, we're good. Those are the core concepts in Gitflow, right? Gitflow pushes toward a release concept, and really, master stays pretty pristine, pretty clean. And anytime you have a hotfix, something that you need to get out right away, you branch from master, fix that, and then merge those things back into dev and back into master at the same time. Make sense? What kind of questions do you have associated with that?
You actually tag and release. Do you release the exact commit that is the merged version of master?
Say that one more time for me.
So at the top of your page, we have the orange one going into the blue one. The actual snapshot that is literally deployed, is that the blue one or the orange one?
Truly, effectively, they're the same thing. So from Git's perspective, when you merge these in here, they're the same. Well, it depends. Okay, so that depends. It depends on how you did a merge. You can do a fast forward merge and they become the same commit, or you can do a merge where you don't fast forward and you basically get that history and you get kind of a new commit.
Yeah, a lot of the projects we work on, we like to actually put. So if you didn't notice, right, every commit has a unique identifier.
Mm-hmm.
We actually put the unique identifier in the code base at build time.
Nice.
So that when it's in production and we think we trust our master branch, we can definitely trust our master because it's a unique identifier. So, and we always do it at the,
Yeah, right. Yep.
Is it config?
It must be a part of your build system.
yeah, as part of in the build, you just do a git add, or whatever the command is. to
But
git.
adding that changes history, therefore adds a new commit.
They must not be putting their
It's
build
only
into
in
the.
artifact.
Okay.
It's not in the source code.
Yeah, that's so you're rewriting during build. Okay, yeah.
Right. Yeah.
We also do version numbers.
Yeah. I guess, yeah, I kind of missed that too. So in a hotfix, that's typically when we would increment our patch, right? 1.2 was the version that we had. We had a hotfix in there, so we increment the patch level on there as well, 1.2.1 per se. So, the reason I presented it like this, there are tools and there are commands that make Gitflow pretty easy. They do a lot of this stuff for you, right? But really, it's more important to know what it's supposed to do, right? Know what the pattern is, so that way if you ever have a problem with some of those tools, you really can reproduce it manually. I do all my Gitflow stuff manually. Almost all of it. I create my features with Git, whatever. So I'll showcase just really quickly source tree. Not that I like this tool and I'm advocating for this tool. However, one of the nice things about source tree is that it does incorporate Gitflow into its workflow, right? Not that I have a develop branch, so clone new.
Is Gitflow a mentality or technology?
Same word. Both. It's really both, but in my mind, it's more the mentality. There are people who've created a set of tools and a suite of tools to do it for you, but it's really not that hard to do yourself. You know what I mean? So I don't see the big benefit of using the tools and all that kind of stuff, because it's really not that hard. And if you're thinking about the cleanliness of your project, and you have the right mental model of what's supposed to be where, it's pretty easy, right? I made a hotfix, I pushed that into master. If I don't push that into dev, right, I'm going to lose that hotfix. Somebody's going to release something 6 weeks from now, and I'm going to have the same bug in it that has already been fixed, right? You see what I'm getting at? So I'm just not a big advocate of the tools. I'm a big advocate of thinking about the status of your source tree and kind of keep things clean. However, Gitflow does have this concept where you can by default it will set up Gitflow, right? If you've not created used Gitflow before, it'll create your develop branch. It'll kind of create this feature area, a release area, and a hotfix area. And then what happens once you have a project set up? You can start a feature, you can start a hotfix, you can finish a feature, you can finish a hotfix, and it will automatically do the merge into master, merge into all this kind of stuff or whatever for you. But again, I don't particularly use it. There are a set of commands as well that do the same thing, right? So Git is for some users, is very command line focused, and there are a set of tools for Gitflow that you can do on the command line that do all of these same things for you. You say start a feature, it grabs the latest copy of develop, it makes a feature out. When you say finish feature, it pulls that stuff back into develop. When you say start a release, it pulls that from develop. You go through testing, you make your bugs, you say finish the release, it pushes it into master, it pushes it into develop. It's pretty straightforward.
Actually, on Windows, you get a tool called GitK that gives you a similar feature to that.
Oh, GitK, yeah.
On like Mac and Linux, you have to install something.
Yeah. This particular repository is not so great. I don't have a whole lot of branches in here, but right, GitK will show you the history of all your stuff and show your branches and out and all that kind of stuff. This is not a particular Gitflow project, but yeah. What else?
Tom, do you ever make changes directly in your development, or do you always put it into a feature?
Yeah, so it really depends on what your release cycles look like, right? We have several projects that we actually don't do releases on, right? We have projects that we just do everything. In fact, most of our stuff we don't pull specific releases. We'll branch something out that's not ready for the next release. We'll build up to the point where we're ready for the next release, and we'll actually kind of bug fix and then go to master from there. It's all a question about what state you want to be in when you want to call for that release, right? So if you're really confident that whatever you're putting in and develop at that point is going into the next release and is ready, it's not going to take you a lot of time to put into the system. It's not going to cause the rest of the developers on your team to not be able to use the system. Yeah, I feel really confident that you can put that stuff and develop. If you've got something like you're ripping out a subsystem, right, and you may leave the system in a pretty unstable state for a while, branch that out, do that work in tandem, pull dev changes as you go, and then push that back into develop when you're really confident that everything's good and clean, kind of thing. It's a judgment call. And that's what makes some of this stuff hard, is it's just judgment call. Because if you feature branch everything, sometimes our release cycles are every few days, right? Once a week. So I've got 15 feature branches. I don't remember what everybody's working on for what feature, kind of stuff. So you got to find some sanity in there somewhere, and it's a judgment call.
So much of it too comes down to how you work with your team, how your team is used to setting releases, and when and how, what kind of discipline you can get them under.
There are some other concepts that I can talk about. I mean, people's brains may be hurting a little bit. The only other thing that I thought about contributing to this conversation that I really left out is that we talk about GitHub for centralized repository, right? So I get a copy of the code, I pull it down, I push some changes into GitHub. Inherently, Git is a decentralized version control system. So for years we had not TeamCity, but SourceSafe, Subversion, and things like that are all focused on really this central server that everybody checks into and checks out of, right? Git really, when it was created, and the whole concept behind it, is decentralized. The concept of GitHub didn't exist back in the day. I'd have a repository, Mike would have a repository, you'd have a repository, and we're potentially all working on the same project doing our stuff. I would sync up directly with Mike's repository. I'd sync up directly with your repository. We would share changes and end up with individual repositories that have everybody else's changes in them. That's actually a workflow that's still pretty popular even with GitHub, where individual people have their own GitHub accounts for their repositories, and they share changes across each other, kind of thing. It gets a little bit weird, but it's actually pretty interesting. It's got some good conveniences to it. You end up with one person who's a repository master, right? They're responsible for what they allow into the main line of work. Mike can go off and do his work. You think about an open source project, right? Umbraco is a system we use. Well, they've got a mainline master that they contribute to, but I, as a developer, I found a bug. They're not giving me access to go push that stuff directly into their repository, so I fire up a Git account, right? I pull a copy of all their stuff down, I make some changes to it, and I say, hey, John, GitHub owner, or Umbraco owner, pull these changes into your repository. They're good. I fixed this bug that you didn't even know you had in there. It gives him an opportunity to review the change set that I made and either accept it or reject it. We get a little conversation workflow kind of thing going on GitHub. And so if I've got a bug in my code, he can say, yeah, this is good, but you need to fix this, or that's not how our documentation SOP works. Change your code, add these comments to your system, or whatever. I can make those changes, update my pull request, and he can say, you know what, it's good, and he can pull it back into the Umbraco code base. It's just a little bit of a separation out. So you don't have to use GitHub as this centralized place where everybody communicates. There are workflows that go cross-person, cross-user, cross-system kind of thing. It gets really pretty powerful that way. But that's what it was designed to do.
Yeah, there are still plenty of teams that work in the same office and work like that. It's interesting.
What did you use to actually make the presentation?
Yeah, so it really sucked, right? Because I wanted to do this. I had a mental model of what I wanted to do. But I wasn't going to go create all the graphics and all the things for all this stuff. So I was actually going to just boost. So it reminds me, Atlassian. Go to Atlassian, do a Google search for Atlassian Gitflows. They have a great set of articles on there about different workflows. I mean, it really is great. Do a Google search for Gitflow. I think Vincent Dreissen's got a blog post where he talks about it. You'll see a lot of the same stuff. Anyway, I was going to boost the graphics from those things and really just kind of talk about those concepts. I found this thing called GitGraph.js. Do you want to see it? Do you want to see what the code looks like at all?
Sure.
Anybody?
Code.
Found this thing called GitGraph, right? And you get to mock up in JavaScript things like a commit. You can create a commit and all that stuff, and it basically will just draw it out. So I just went through. right? So I set up this local concept, and I really just have a couple of commands in here, right? I create a local branch, I make some commits, I make a bad branch, I make some commits, and it really just does the beauty of drawing it out. Yeah, it's pretty cool. I made a couple of small changes to it, bogus commit logs, some
Have you
things like
tried
that.
to take like an actual repo and shove in the commits into that?
No, no, I did all this by hand as far as just kind of logging these things out. But it was a whole heck of a lot easier than literally drawing all the kind of stuff and creating the phases of the presentation that I wanted.
Was that an array push in the code or a method of the library?
Which one?
In the code?
So I cheated, right? I hacked it. Well,
I can't tell if it's an array push or like a part of that code's API.
no, this is an array push.
Okay.
I did this so that I could stage up phases of the presentation, right? I wanted to do these things and talk about that, and then I wanted to do these things and talk about that. So I kind of created this little array thing that I just it creates a couple of steps, and then I've got a little thing over here that shows me where I am, and it kind of syncs it up and tells me where I am in the flow. But anyway, it was a lifesaver. Get graph.js. It was a lifesaver. If Matthew.
Yeah, Matt
Yeah, Matt Decker, yeah.
Matt Decker. So if he doesn't have anything yet, or if he wants to show anything in that kind of a format, it's a lifesaver.
Yeah, I've seen this presentation before. I think he actually opens the file system and shows you like how the SHAs are tracked on the file system.
I was going to say, I think that he's going low level. He's going with all.
Sure.
He's going to talk about the commands. He's going to talk about what it means to pull and clone and check out and push and all that kind of stuff. Rebasing. So yeah, so it's honestly it should be a really good presentation. I wish that we had done it before this one, but
We could get into a merge flow argument with freebasing.
Hmm.
Very basic version.
so it may look, if you look at the whole thing, it's like, oh, that looks really scary or whatever. It's really not that big a deal, right? It's a couple of branches. You're keeping track of what you want to go where and when.
That's really true. When you first start looking into this, it really does look daunting, and then it's crazy how just second nature it becomes just throw these things all over the place.
Yep.
It's nothing.
If it says release, it means this. If it says feature, it means that. If it's in master, it's live.
Something that's really helped us with that too is being decentralized. We don't have as many problems with a developer checking in something that doesn't work entirely.
Yeah.
Because it's their own local repository, and they don't push anything
Mm-hmm.
to the central one on GitHub until they know it's working.
Yeah.
So you can have multiple commits, and you don't just have a bunch of changes all on your local development machine that you don't have any sort of organization to, that you're then trying to just push all at once or breaking everybody else.
Yep.
Yeah.
We also utilize, so that everything that goes into our GitHub repo, the centralized one, has to be pull requested by somebody else. And so that you get your third-party code review by
Right.
having someone else merge those changes and approve them and all that type of stuff. So it's
Mhm.
helpful to kind of, especially in teams, be able to double-check each other that way.
Yeah, I mean, Git. The one thing great about Git is commits and branches are cheap. They're cheap. They're fast. They're easy. If you're guessing whether or not you should use one, go ahead. Right? You can always kind of change out, pull that stuff around, or whatever. Branches are cheap. Commits are relatively cheap. Just try to be a little cohesive about ganging those things up and organizing them.
And Git is free too, right?
Git is free.
That-
hmm And even like GitHub and Bitbucket provide free services for centralization. Again, the billing, they do bill for those services. It kind of depends on, again, how you want to use it, right? One charges you for the number of private repositories, the other charges you for the number of users.
And by branching being cheap, that is by way of performance, not by way of monetary.
Oh, right, yeah, performance.
Subversion branching, I mean, sometimes looking at a few minutes and hoping it didn't break everything.
Yeah. So back in the day, like in Subversion, anybody use Subversion? So right, if you checked out a Subversion repository, all the concepts of the branches were all in one folder, right? If you wanted to make a change to a branch, you opened that folder on your machine, you made the changes, and you pushed those things up in that folder. In Git, it really kind of represents your current checked out state, right? You've got one folder that has all of your project files in it, but I don't have a folder for this branch and a folder for that branch. I tell Git, switch to this branch, and it changes all of the files to the current state in that branch. And I say, okay, well, I'm done with those things, made some commits, switch back to develop, and it basically changes all my stuff back to the last state of develop. So really, that's one of the things to consider. Branching is cheap, it's fast. You branch out, you switch back and forth, it's pretty quick. You don't have to have one folder for develop, one folder for a feature, and one folder for some other branch or a release. You just kind of switch your context. You say, change my local folder to the release context. Change my local folder to this feature now. Oh, I'm done with those things. Go back to develop. Bring in this thing, kind of thing. It's pretty cheap and pretty easy, pretty quick. One command, right?
Is there a project size or like a company size that might be a really big company where Gitflow doesn't really make sense? Like if you got 20 different feature branches going on all at once?
So admittedly, we run a small team, so I really don't have a lot of experience coordinating dozens of people. So I can't give you any kind of personal experience about whether or not I think Gitflow will manage that very well. Sorry.
Does I know GitHub takes I remember reading something about their stance on Gitflow, and they were really opposed to the idea because of the way it worked for their company. I feel like maybe I remember reading something about Atlassian really adopting.
Yeah, they use it. That's why they've got it in source tree.
Huge company.
Yeah, that's true. Atlassian is using it.
The Linux kernel uses it.
Right.
They use Gitflow?
Yeah.
Great.
It's not,
Linus.
its problems don't come from the
Really?
size of the team, but more how releases are built.
Mhm.
Yes, very true. Yeah.
So if you do
Like
continuous
functions.
delivery, Gitflow doesn't work so hot.
Right. Continuous delivery. Yeah, makes sense. I could see that. What else?
In your organization, what is a standard commit size and time? How long will somebody wait to commit?
Oh, it's an individual thing. Honestly, to tell you the truth, some individuals will go a couple of days without committing. I commit every couple of hours. You know what I mean? Once I get the project to a semi-stable state, and I don't want to lose some changes, I'll commit that.
So at our company, we actually do story branches. So, and every story branch has probably 30 or 40 commits on it. And those are like minute combined commits.
Oh, wow.
So we have no problem having them through, as long as you're in the story branch.
Interesting.
It's similar to the feature branch, but on a very small level.
Yeah.
When you merge it in when the story's done.
So that's almost like an autosave, current state kind of thing.
Yeah, well, I mean, we also do test-driven development, so it's really once you do the red, the green, and the refactor.
I gotcha. Mm-hmm.
Same. I was just curious.
They're buttoned up over there, man.
They are buttoned up
Yeah.
over there.
Yeah.
2 weeks will be the other presentation, and he'll talk about merging strategies too. We'll talk about rebasing and things like that, where you're rewriting what it looks like once you finally push these things into a branch. In theory, when I've got all these things in this feature, once this merges in, this development branch actually sees and looks like it has all these individual commits. But there are actually techniques to squash all of those commits down into one lump and say, boom, one set of changes that kind of come in here. We don't use that workflow, but it's fairly common. You guys probably use a rebase workflow? No, we don't either. I don't mind having the history of changes in there. I kind of like it. So it's good stuff. For some awkward silence.
Yeah. All right. Thanks, Tom.